In today's story, we dive into a confrontation that escalated quickly. An ex-police officer, known for his calm demeanor, was pushed to his limits when a trespasser, a Karen, thought she could ignore boundaries and claim what wasn't hers. But little did she know, this would be a lesson she wouldn't forget. Stay tuned as we break down the tension, the actions, and the moment of reckoning that followed. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life drama that reveals how far one person. It was a sunny afternoon, and the officer was enjoying a peaceful day at home. But his tranquility was shattered when he noticed someone stepping over the fence, making their way to his pool. He initially thought it was a mistake, maybe someone had wandered onto his property by accident. But as the woman settled by the pool, ignoring the private property signs clearly visible, it became evident this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. She was there with a sense of entitlement, as though the officer, already irritated by the audacity of the trespasser, approached her calmly at first. He cleared his throat, trying to remain composed. "Excuse me, ma'am, but this is private property. You're not allowed to be here," he said, hoping the polite approach would be enough. But instead of responding with understanding, she just scoffed and waved him off. "I'm just here to relax." "You can't be serious about this," she snapped, further igniting his frustration. Little did she know, the OFFI. The situation was starting to feel like it was spiraling out of control. The officer, trying to remain calm, repeated himself. "Please, leave my property." He had no intention of letting things escalate, but this woman wasn't backing down. The Karen stereotype was becoming all too real in this moment, as she continued to argue with him, acting as though she had every right to be there. The officer's patience was running thin, but he didn't want to let anger dictate his next move. Yet, frustrated by her refusal to leave, the officer made a decision. He wasn't going to tolerate this behavior anymore. The trespassing wasn't just a minor issue to him, it was about respect. This was his home, his space, and she had crossed a line. He took a step closer, voice firm but controlled. "I'm asking you one last time. Leave, or I'll be forced to call the authorities." His words were direct, but his demeanor remained calm, a reminder that even when pushed, he could maintain his composure. At that moment, the woman's face shifted. She had expected him to back down, to tolerate her behavior. But seeing the officer's unwavering stance made her realize she wasn't going to get away with this one. She hesitated, then shot back with a defensive, "You can't just tell me what to do. This is ridiculous." But the officer's quiet resolve had already made it clear, this wasn't a situation she was going to win. She was about to learn that pushing someone too far could lead to serious consequences. The officer stood there, silent for a moment, assessing the situation. His calm demeanor was his greatest strength. He wasn't going to let this situation turn into something more violent, but he also wasn't going to let her walk all over him. After a long pause, he pulled out his phone and dialed the authorities. "This is my property. I'm calling the police now," he stated firmly. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief, as though she couldn't comprehend why someone would actually take this mat. The woman, now realizing that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding, quickly shifted tactics. "You're really calling the cops over this?" she asked incredulously. The officer simply nodded, his finger hovering over the dial button. There was no point in negotiating with someone who didn't understand the concept of boundaries. The woman stood still for a moment, glancing around as if trying to gauge whether she could still talk her way out of this. It was too late now, the line had been DR. As the phone rang, the officer remained steadfast, awaiting the response. The woman, realizing her options were dwindling, huffed in frustration. "You're ruining my day for nothing," she snapped, but the officer didn't flinch. "I'm protecting mine, just like you would," he responded. She stood there for a second, almost like she was waiting for a change in the situation, but the officer wasn't about to budge. He had made it clear, this wasn't about an argument, it was about principle. The call to the authorities didn't take long, but the officer's resolve was being tested with every second. The woman began pacing nervously, now clearly uncomfortable with how the situation had turned. She knew she couldn't win this battle. "I was just trying to enjoy a moment of peace," she muttered, more to herself than to the officer. He didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. The officer was no longer concerned with her reasoning, he was focused on protecting his rights and his pee. The police car pulled up in the driveway, the woman's face turned pale. The officer had stood his ground, and now the consequences of her actions were becoming very real. The officers stepped out of the car and approached them. The woman immediately tried to explain herself, but her words were drowned out by the officer's clear, concise explanation. "This woman trespassed on my property, and despite multiple warnings, refused to leave." It was all he needed to say, and the woman realized the. As the police officers took over, the woman's defense became increasingly desperate. She tried to argue her case, claiming she was just taking a dip and didn't mean any harm. But the officers weren't having it. They had dealt with enough trespassing complaints to know that the officer wasn't exaggerating the situation. One of the officers turned to the officer who had called them and nodded in understanding. The situation was clear now, the woman was in the wrong, and there would be consequences. Seeing the situation slip out of her control, the woman's frustration mounted. She attempted to argue with the police officers, but it was like speaking to a brick wall. The officer who had initially confronted her stood quietly in the background, watching the scene unfold. His role in the confrontation was done, but it was clear that his calm, measured response had been the reason why the situation hadn't escalated further. As the police wrote up a report, the woman's attitude shifted, and she. The officers, having gathered the details, told the woman that she would be receiving a citation for trespassing. There was no getting around it now. The woman's face flushed red with embarrassment as the reality of the situation settled in. She had crossed a line, and now she was going to have to pay the price. She shot the officer a glare, but he remained unfazed. He had done what needed to be done to protect his space, and that was all that mattered to him. As the woman reluctantly gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, the officer walked over to her, his voice steady but firm. "Next time, think twice before you ignore someone's boundaries," he said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a reminder. The woman didn't respond, but the message had been delivered loud and clear. It wasn't just about the pool or the trespassing, it was about respecting others' rights and space. She had learned that lesson the hard way. The police officers finished up their paperwork, and as they prepared to leave, the officer who had called them turned to the other officer. "I can't believe people think they can just walk all over others," he said, shaking his head. The other officer nodded in agreement. "It's a shame," he replied. As they left the property, the officer stood by the gate, watching them drive away. He had protected his home, his space, and his peace, and in doing so, had also reminded everyone about the import. After the incident, the officer stood in his backyard, reflecting on the events that had just transpired. He wasn't angry, but there was a sense of satisfaction in knowing that he had stood firm in his beliefs. The peace he had worked so hard to maintain had been interrupted, but he had regained control. He knew that not everyone would understand his actions, but for him, it was about more than just a pool, it was about respecting boundaries, no matter who you are. In the days that followed, the story of the officer and the Karen trespasser began to spread. Some people praised the officer for his restraint, acknowledging that he had handled the situation with dignity and patience. Others, however, criticized him, claiming that he overreacted. But the officer didn't let the opinions of others affect him. He knew what he had done was right. And more importantly, he had sent a message: crossing boundaries had consequences, regardless of who you were. As time passed, the officer received messages from neighbors and friends, commending him for standing his ground. Many people shared similar stories of boundary violations and trespassing, and it became clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. The officer had unwittingly become a symbol of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. For him, it was a lesson learned and one he hoped others would take to heart. Protecting one's space was more than just a personal right, it was a. The woman, on the other hand, wasn't as easily able to forget the incident. Word spread about her trespassing, and the backlash started to affect her life. Her friends and family began to question her actions, and she was forced to come to terms with the consequences of her entitled behavior. She had been so sure of her actions, but the reality of the situation hit her hard. She realized that her behavior wasn't just a mistake, it was a lesson in respect, and one she wouldn't soon forget. One day, several weeks after the incident, the woman reached out to the officer. She left a simple message: "I just wanted to apologize." The officer, while surprised, appreciated the gesture. He didn't respond immediately, but the fact that she had recognized her wrongdoings meant something. Sometimes, it takes a confrontation to remind people of what truly matters, and this was a case where both parties learned valuable lessons. The officer had stood up for his boundaries, and the woman had. As time went on, the officer found himself reflecting on the event more and more. He realized that it wasn't just about the trespassing incident, it was about the bigger picture. It was about society's growing disregard for boundaries and respect. People often assumed they could take whatever they wanted, without consequences. This mindset was something he felt was becoming more prevalent in today's world. But for him, maintaining peace meant standing firm in the face of that entitlement, even. The officer's community began to rally behind him, recognizing that he had taken a stand for something much larger than just his property. His actions inspired others to stand firm in protecting their own personal space. Neighbors began discussing boundaries and respect more openly, understanding that maintaining peace required everyone to respect each other's space. The officer, though never one to seek attention, unknowingly became a catalyst for a movement in his community, one that emphasizes. Meanwhile, the woman, who had once been so confident in her entitlement, found herself reflecting on her actions. She couldn't escape the embarrassment of the situation. The apology she had sent to the officer had been sincere, but she knew it wasn't enough. The reputation she had built on arrogance and entitlement was now being questioned by those around her. People who once saw her as a strong, independent individual now saw someone who had ignored the most basic human decency, respect. The woman, realizing she couldn't just move past the incident, decided to take a different route. She started engaging in conversations about boundaries, respect, and entitlement, sharing her own experience as a lesson to others. It wasn't an easy thing to admit her wrongdoings, but she found peace in knowing that she could make amends. By using her mistake to teach others, she found a way to reclaim her dignity and start rebuilding the relationships she had damaged. The officer continued with his life, his commitment to maintaining peace stronger than ever. He didn't seek acknowledgement or praise for his actions, his quiet resolve spoke for itself. As he moved forward, he remained vigilant about protecting his space and respecting others' rights. And while he knew that not every conflict would be resolved peacefully, he also understood that standing up for what's right, regardless of the outcome, was the only way to create a society where respect and boundary. Months passed, and the officer's life returned to normal. Yet, the ripple effect of that one confrontation lingered in the community. People began to talk about the importance of boundaries in a way they hadn't before. It wasn't just about fences or private property anymore, it was about respecting personal space, time, and privacy in every aspect of life. The officer's once quiet neighborhood now buzzed with conversations about standing up for what's right, and more importantly, holding others. The woman, who had initially been defensive and dismissive, began to see things from a new perspective. She had been living in a bubble of privilege and entitlement, thinking she could do whatever she pleased without consequences. But now, as she reflected on her actions, she realized how out of touch she had been with the basic principles of respect and consideration. In the months that followed, she found herself engaging in self-reflection, trying to understand the deeper reasons behind her In the officer's own life, things began to settle back into a familiar rhythm. But now, there was a sense of empowerment in his actions. He knew that standing up for what he believed in wasn't always easy, but it was always necessary. The day he called the police on that trespasser was a reminder that sometimes, you have to be the one to set boundaries, even if it means facing criticism. He had learned that the true measure of strength wasn't in physical confrontation, but in the ability to privately, thanking him for teaching them the importance of standing up for themselves and their space. He never expected recognition or praise. For him, it was about doing what needed to be done. But hearing others share how his actions had inspired them gave him a sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just about that one woman, it was about creating a ripple effect that would continue to influence. As the officer looked back on the events, he realized that the confrontation had been a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone involved. It had been a test of character, one that had forced both him and the woman to examine their actions and attitudes. While the initial clash had been unpleasant, it had ultimately led to a deeper understanding of personal responsibility and respect. In the end, the officer's actions proved that standing firm in your principles can have a profound impact. The officer's story began to resonate with many people, sparking a larger conversation about personal boundaries and respect. Over time, the incident became a reference point in the community for how to handle situations where people overstep their limits. Local discussions, online forums, and even social media posts started reflecting the officer's stance, emphasizing the need to protect personal space and address violations head-on. It became clear that one individual's decision to stand up for. Meanwhile, the woman's journey of self-awareness was far from over. She began attending workshops on communication, personal boundaries, and emotional intelligence. She was determined to change, to better understand why she had acted the way she did. Her once strong belief that entitlement could push her through life was now being replaced with a deeper understanding of how actions have consequences. It wasn't just about apologizing anymore, it was about changing her behavior, learning from the. Despite the rough start, the officer had unintentionally sparked a shift in the way his community viewed personal space. It wasn't that they hadn't respected boundaries before, but the idea of taking action when boundaries were violated hadn't been as strongly reinforced. Now, more people felt empowered to speak up when their personal space was disrespected. It wasn't about confrontation, but about establishing clear boundaries in a world that was increasingly becoming more chaotic. The officer. For the woman, every step forward was a reminder of the lessons learned from her confrontation with the officer. She realized that people who truly respect others don't take advantage of situations. Through her own journey of self-reflection, she learned that entitlement doesn't make someone superior, it only isolates them from those around them. She became an advocate for respecting others' space, using her experience to warn others against repeating her mistakes. It was her way of turning an. Looking back on everything, the officer felt a deep sense of contentment. The incident with the woman had tested his resolve, but it had also reaffirmed his belief in the importance of standing firm for what was right. He knew that every action, no matter how small, could have a lasting impact. It wasn't just about protecting his property anymore, it was about leading by example. By staying calm and assertive, he had not only protected his home, but had also inspired a movement of respect and As the months passed, the officer continued to live his life with the same quiet determination. His actions that day had caused a ripple effect, and he couldn't help but feel proud of how things had unfolded. He wasn't the type to seek recognition or praise, but the respect he gained from his community was a testament to his principles. For the officer, it wasn't about being a hero, it was about standing firm in his values, no matter the outcome. And in this case, those values had inspired others. The woman's life had also shifted in unexpected ways. She continued to work on herself, attending self-help seminars, reading about emotional maturity, and engaging in conversations about empathy. The incident with the officer had been a wake-up call, and she knew she couldn't ignore the lessons it had taught her. Over time, she became more mindful of her behavior, especially when it came to respecting others' personal space. She learned that true strength wasn't in pushing boundaries but in KN. One afternoon, the officer bumped into the woman at a local store. She approached him, not with the arrogance she had displayed before, but with a sincere smile and an outstretched hand. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, "for teaching me a lesson I didn't know I needed. I've been trying to do better, and I truly appreciate the way you handled things that day." The officer looked at her, his expression neutral but understanding. "I'm glad you learned something from it," he said, before wall. As the officer continued his daily routine, the realization hit him that the consequences of that one day had spread far beyond his own life. People in his community were more aware of their own boundaries, and they spoke up when necessary. Conversations about respect and entitlement became common in local coffee shops, at community meetings, and even in casual conversations between friends. He had unknowingly sparked a cultural shift in his neighborhood, one that would outlast the incident. In the end, both the officer and the woman walked away with more than they had bargained for. The officer gained a deeper sense of peace and satisfaction in knowing he had done what was necessary to protect his space, while the woman learned valuable lessons about entitlement, boundaries, and respect. The incident had taught them both that actions have consequences, but it had also shown them that growth was possible, even after a mistake. It was a reminder that sometimes, the hardest lessons. Months after the confrontation, the officer often found himself reflecting on the series of events. What started as a seemingly trivial trespassing incident had evolved into a powerful lesson in personal space, boundaries, and respect. The officer knew that, while things had settled down, the lesson had reached a much wider audience than he initially anticipated. People were more cautious, more considerate, and the value of mutual respect had started to take root in his community. For the woman, the path toward self-improvement wasn't without its challenges. Her initial journey of introspection began to open her eyes to patterns in her behavior that she had once ignored. She realized that her sense of entitlement had caused her to dismiss the feelings and rights of others. But, instead of wallowing in guilt, she focused on how she could actively change. The incident had left an indelible mark on her, but it was that mark that propelled her toward becoming a more mindful. As the woman grew more self-aware, she began to approach others who had been affected by her behavior. It wasn't always easy, and sometimes the conversations were awkward, but she knew it was necessary. By reaching out and acknowledging her past actions, she found that healing was possible, not just for her, but for those she had wronged. It was through vulnerability and accountability that she began to rebuild the trust she had lost. In the community, the officer had become a quiet symbol of standing up for what's right. While he didn't seek the spotlight, others began to recognize his role in promoting respect and boundary setting. More people approached him in passing, expressing gratitude for his actions. They often shared how they had confronted their own challenges with boundaries after witnessing his calm but firm approach. It wasn't about the officer becoming a local hero, it was about the ripple effect of his actions. Looking back, both the officer and the woman had come a long way. Their lives had intersected in a moment of conflict, but it had ultimately led to personal growth and transformation. The officer had learned the importance of enforcing boundaries and standing firm in his beliefs, while the woman had gained insight into the true value of empathy, respect, and understanding. Their story became a reminder that, no matter how small the issue may seem at first, standing up for what's right can change. Years later, the officer's story was still talked about in the community. It had become one of those unforgettable moments that people referenced when they needed to emphasize the importance of standing up for what's right. The lesson wasn't just about trespassing, it was about defending personal boundaries in all aspects of life. The officer had inspired countless people to be more assertive when necessary, but to also approach situations with calmness and respect. He had shown them that power. The journey had been long, but it had led to a deeper understanding of her own character. Over time, she had become an advocate for personal boundaries, sharing her own story to help others who might have similar experiences. She often told people that learning respect wasn't something that came easily, but it was something worth striving for. Her past actions had taught her the hard way, but she used those lessons to build a life based on empathy and awareness. One day, the officer and the woman crossed paths again, this time at a community gathering. They exchanged smiles and a few words, acknowledging the mutual respect that had developed between them over the years. The officer had long forgiven her, but what was more important was that the woman had learned and grown from the experience. She had become someone who actively worked on her character, making sure that she never repeated the mistakes of the past. It was a silent but powerful acknowledgement. The officer never fully understood the magnitude of his actions that day. To him, it had been a simple matter of standing up for what was right. But to those around him, it had become a symbol of integrity and accountability. Over the years, he received messages from strangers, people who had heard about the incident and had been inspired to stand firm in their own lives. They shared how they had stood up to their own Karens, whether at work, in personal relationships, or in public spaces, and looking back at everything that had happened, both the officer and the woman had reached a place of peace. They had learned that even the most challenging situations could lead to growth if one was willing to learn from them. The officer continued to live his life quietly, proud of his role in teaching his community the importance of respect and boundaries. The woman, forever changed by that fateful day, became a person who not only respected the space of others but also encouraged others to do